Right, so today we're joined by Scott, who is a head coach and owner at Primal MMA. So today the plan is to have a little chat about overcoaching and undercoaching and maybe some things that go along with that. So first of all, thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Becoming a big fan of your content.
Appreciate it. Very good. So do you want to give us like a quick background and intro before we get into it?
Okay, I'll give you a fairly short version. I moved to the US about 15 years ago, looking for a new hobby and outlet. I did some karate when I was younger back in Scotland, but walked into Duke Rufus kickboxing gym over here and fell in love with the sport. A little later, I guess that's probably a good thing or a bad thing, whatever the way I look at it. Competed at an amateur level for a couple of years and then had a couple of young sons and decided I was getting too old for this. I always say you don't realize how young 30 is until you hit 40. So stepped into coaching, and I've said before, had absolutely no business coaching. I was a complete fraud and imposter. But that I could have went two ways with that. I could have continued to do that or really buckle down and try and actually learn the disciplines and skills of coaching. Went back to college to do a degree in athletic development coaching and fell down a few rabbit holes that we spoke about, coming across Trevor Reagan's work, a couple of other guys in that area, and didn't realize how detailed and rich the coaching space was. So I'm still consider myself somewhat of a novice, but I'm trying hard to catch up with you guys.
That's fantastic. So we probably would have got in touch originally with we came across you on a Talent Equation podcast, and you put out some very good content there, and particularly it was good for us because we've been listening to that for a while now and kind of playing in that space of ecological dynamics and things like that. But we haven't really seen the martial arts scene come up too often. So for us, at least, it was something that we kind of had to take from other field sports and team sports in particular and kind of like adapt to what we are doing a little bit. So yeah, how was your experience with that been?
Well, I get a lot from these podcasts as well. In fact, there's a couple, if you don't mind dropping them. There's one I was listening to again last night from a Coach Your Brains Out, it's called. It's actually a volleyball podcast. I get a great deal from that. They have some wonderful guests. The challenge with martial arts, especially what I'm trying to do here, is balance the obvious risk of the head trauma and chronic injury over training authentically. And I'm not sure I've come on the answer yet. I'm not sure I ever will. So I'm glad to get these opportunities and learn from you guys and see what you guys are doing.
Yeah, because we spoke before about this, about the whole idea of we're kind of lucky that way that our sport is semi-contact, so we can actually afford to do a little bit more transferable and realistic practice more than the full contact domains, so we are a little bit fortunate there. So certainly that's a challenge for MMA and the likes to get over. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm speaking mostly from the striking discipline in MMA. Of course, we can do the wrestling and the jiu-jitsu, and you told me took that up yourself recently. We can really get quite authentic training there.
Yeah.
And I still see it across the board, this traditional dogmatic style, and I don't think it's very effective. But the burden of proof is on myself and you guys to show that this is really the best way with what we think we're talking in our philosophies.
Yeah, it's a great place to start, actually, isn't it? I mean, because no matter what, when you jump into these conversations, the very first and most obvious question that anyone would ask is, well, what was wrong with the way we were doing it before? It obviously worked for whoever got to the top doing what they've been doing. And where do you find yourself starting that conversation?
Well, I think I've mentioned this in every conversation. I'm trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I was definitely guilty of doing that, and I was also guilty of using the old model and the old methods for many years. I think we'll get into that and how we coach and specifically over coaching. A couple of the challenges I have now is, as I said, the burden of proof is going to be on me. Where are the results? Where are the champions? Where are the accolades? And I'm quite confident that they'll come. And if they don't come, I don't think it'll be as a result of the science and the philosophy. It'll be some other factors that I've slipped up on or haven't paid attention to. But, and I know we live in a little bit of an echo chamber here, all the guys in the space, but there doesn't seem to be very profound counter argument to what we're talking about, other than, as you said, lots of people have had success using that method. But
and you would have had a lot of experience in that, Scott, as well, training with the likes of, I think you said to me before, you trained with Anthony Pettis and guys like this who obviously would come from that traditional approach. Like, so I think somebody who comes from both spaces and is able to merge a little bit of a gap there together, I think that's a massive advantage.
Right, and we spoke about Pettis last time. He had a lot of autonomy to be creative and stuff. He'd been in the martial arts game for so long. So when he walked in the gym and transferred over to MMA, he was already ticking a lot of the boxes, to be something quite special. But he's actually fighting this week again against Donald. So I'm looking forward to it.
That'd be good. Yeah, so I think that actually sets us up nicely for the whole conversation of over and under coaching, just like you say there, of somebody who's almost like creative and free flowing. You wouldn't really relate that to somebody who is really over coached, I guess. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I mentioned Anthony. I only trained with him for 2 or 3 years actually before I moved on, and he had quite a great deal of experience before he came. So I'm not privy to exactly how he's been training the last 5 or 6 years. However, he was something, as I say, he did get afforded a lot of creativity and a lot of autonomy to show that creativity, because he was always flashy. So they didn't try and remake him in any way, and you could argue that might be a detriment, because there's apparently some holes that he's never managed to kind of fix. But other than that, yeah, exceptional talent. Yeah,
and that's something, Adrian, that we've spoke about a lot, the whole idea of having these like personal quirks, but they actually become massive advantages. So like, even when we take from our own sport, there's a lot of guys who come to mind who they wouldn't be like traditionally well drilled in terms of technique and things like that, but are very, very effective.
But what you do get, and again, like what Scott was saying there, is when a person arrives into a context, like, for example, someone walking to our national team and they're there because they've won selection. You're willing to, coaches are happy enough to overlook a quirk because they're successful despite the quirk, or they're successful because of the quirk. But it's a very, very different conversation when you talk to the same coach looking at someone who walks in at 8 and 9 years of age who has a quirk, because they're still looking at that as, I should fix that. That's something I have to fix because it doesn't match the points of performance of the defined skill, or the idealized version of the skill that I have in my head as a coach. And the question doesn't often get asked of, well, yeah, but is it effective for them? Does it work for their body mechanics? Is it a performance limiter? Like, is it really going to hold them back? Or is it something that, look, it might not be ideal, but will it do? Can they emphasize another strength? And sometimes I think when you have a semi-finished article arriving, it's easier to have that broader viewpoint about, well, let's focus on what they already do well, because time is of the essence at that stage. But when someone arrives with their future ahead of them at 8 years of age, it's almost like, no, now I have to go and make them a clone. I have to make this model of the playbook,
And Scott, that's something you've spoken about before, the whole idea of that cookie cutter mindset, and maybe it's not the most practical approach when it comes to martial arts, which is a very dynamic and complex interaction between two human beings.
Well, I think the quirks are actually a real asset, because I think all things being equal, you have two fighters or competitors that are equal in size and range and all that, and I would use the word skill here, but technically wise, they look the same. Then it's going to just come down to, I guess, speed and reactivity. So I certainly see, we spoke about Ferguson, who's fighting this weekend, extremely quirky and unorthodox, and he'll go against these high-level strikers. I'm thinking Barboza, Pettis, guys like that, and just dismantle them, because the reads and the tells and the movement is just not the same. So I'm actually all for quirks and unorthodox styles. I encourage it and support it.
Yeah, Absolutely, because I find even myself when I was ever sparring with somebody who's kind of like quirky, we say, it's, do you know what, my style was always like a counter style, and it was almost impossible to counter somebody like that because everything is just a little bit different and the timing is off, the rhythm is off. So I always found that like the best approach with somebody who is that kind of like quirky is you kind of have to bring the fight to them a little bit, which took me out of my comfort zone a little bit as well. So absolutely, it's definitely kind of like an advantage position to be able to come in different as such, like, you know.
And I think a real world example of that is, and I was speaking to Adam about it, you could be sparring against someone who's maybe only had 6 or 7 months practice, and of course you'll get better at them eventually, but you're asking yourself, why the hell did I get hit with that? Because the cues and the lead up's just not there, you know. They're throwing a left when you're expecting a right and whatnot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was one that if you go back to the beginning of my coaching journey, a little bit like yours, I was definitely an imposter and a fraud that was dropped in the deep end. It kind of got thrown on me, and I took a similar kind of route to figure my way out of that, and I signed up for sport and exercise science. But one of the tips that my instructor had given me is like, don't forget, never spar the beginners. You'll always get injured sparring the beginners. And, you know, that's exactly it. It's so right, because you can feint, you can do all of the different things, but they don't have the, as I said, the experience of perceiving those actions, linking them to an outcome, an event. There's nothing. It's whatever comes to mind sporadic. First and foremost. It's sporadic. You're not going to be able to have predictable behaviors. So when you're sparring beginners, you're always taking a little bit of a risk, and you're probably always going to get hurt, even if you'll outscore them or if you're going to win eventually. But I've always taken that to the heart. I'm not one for getting into the ring with the competitors. I learned that lesson long before I turned 40. So, yeah.
Tell me, I know we're very biased towards coaching, but how much of it do you think of it is somewhat luck? You know, there's a couple of guys, and talk about Pettis, a couple of guys I know. I think we could thrive in almost any gym and environment and under any kind of coach. And I feel sometimes coaches are a little bit too quick to take too much of the credit. And I think maybe a lot of it comes down to luck. You know, how well would Connor have done at another gym? Probably remarkably well, especially in the skills and athletic side. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think there's one other thing that goes with that, which is while some of it is definitely down to luck, some of it is again, luck being in the right place at the right time to take an opportunity as it presents itself. And I would have said that the things that really helped me develop as a coach coming along was that my athletes were better than my coaching ability. So in other words, my athletes were pulling me forward. They kept getting better than I was able to, than my previous level of experience. So I had to go learn and try to follow and chase them along to catch up with the level they were competing at, which throws you into that spiral of, as you said, searching for solutions, searching for new ways to answer questions so that you can stay relevant to them. And I think no matter how lucky or unlucky you are as a coach, at some point you're going to have athletes who have a level of ability that will challenge your level of ability as a coach. Mm-hmm. And when you meet them and you follow along with them, it forces you or challenges you to up your game. Some will, some won't. And I think that's the point where it differentiates is, you know, if you are lucky enough to have an athlete that challenges you because, you know, they respond well to whatever it is you're doing, or just to the fact that they had, you know, the right athletic abilities in the first place, your response to that then I think is, you know, what makes it not just luck. I think that's where the rest of it comes in.
I think that brings up an interesting point as well on the idea of over and under coaching, of the ego of the coach. I think that's really an important factor in this whole thing. What do you think about that, Scott? The whole idea of maybe some coach maybe coming in there with their ego and putting their own, we say, desires before the desires and needs of the athlete.
Well, I think that's pretty typical. I'm probably a little guilty of that myself. I think it's easy to have your ego inflated as a coach. It's perhaps because of that kind of paternal role we have, but I'm always reminded everyone seems to have the best coach in the world. Mm-hmm. They all talk about it. It's almost like the mugs way. You're the greatest dad ever. You know, everyone has one. So I try and keep grounded. But yeah, I'm the same as anyone else. I can let my ego get away with itself. But I'm fortunate that, again, I don't quite have the results yet. So that definitely keeps me grounded. So I'm always second guessing it.
I think as well, it at times that can actually be quite innocent, and it can just come from passion of coaches maybe being so passionate about the sport and about their athletes that they're trying to give all the answers. And at times that can be almost it can be something that will actually hold your athletes back a little bit by being so passionate and looking to give them answers. You actually make them become a little bit dependent on you. And I guess as a coach, especially in the combat side of things, we always want to build athletes who are not really dependent on us and can adapt and make decisions effectively for themselves.
Well, and that brings us, that's a good segue into, when we're talking about over and under coaching and this kind of implicit and explicit, forms of learning and coaching. And I've definitely transitioned from one to the other. Adrian, or Richie as well, I'd be interested in your perspective or your take on what the difference is there between implicit and explicit.
From a learning point of view rather than motivation?
Well, from rather than telling, okay, maybe I'm loading the question wrong.
No, not at all. I mean, I just very often I consider the motivation, the intrinsic versus extrinsic, or the implicit, but like for the in terms of the teaching, like for me, it definitely came from the point of view of you set the task with the solution to the task in mind and with the path to the solution to the task in mind. And it was very much starting from the end and planning your way all the way back to the beginning, and then poking at the athletes anytime they took a foot off the path until they followed your path all the way to the end. And it was, it's very effective in building a level of trust and reliance between, the athlete and the coach if your information is pretty good and your knowledge is pretty good, because it seems then that what you say works because it has an obvious, yeah, the skill got better, or yeah, I won the match. And, I did that because the information you gave me was good and I applied it well. But it runs out fast because you can never, have enough foresight to, outthink all the problems that are going to arrive in front of somebody. And so it's more like, can you equip the person with the principles to solve problems, with good principles to solve a wide variety of problems, rather than the solution to a number of problems, where the number of problems is infinite. There are multiple solutions to every problem. So the more you try to give solutions out, it's just like rote learning, and you can't access it fast enough, where it's far more efficient, just like if you were programming a computer, to give it the principles, let it work out, how to apply the principle. And, you'll be surprised and delighted sometimes when you see a novel answer to the problem.
Yeah, I love that idea about coaching the principles rather than the specifics. And I guess a lot of your work too is in coaching. It revolves around demonstrations, and I'm wondering how many details you would limit yourself to. I watched a video the other day on YouTube because I was trying to clean up a technique of my own and get some concepts down. And the guy that was teaching was wonderfully clear. He was wonderfully concise. He spent about 7 or 8 minutes showing this particular technique, and I counted at least 25 small details. And everyone's in awe of how his technical knowledge and how he was coming across, and he spoke clearly, added a little bit of humor and whatnot. But for me, it was just ridiculously overcoached and too much detail. How do you feel about that? Do you try and restrict yourselves to short, little, snappy details, or?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because there's certainly a fine line between that, because I find that the more details you give, the more certain athletes will pick up on certain things that are kind of relevant to them. And I think it all comes back to kind of like what's relevant to us when we get information. For example, you might read a book and it might just hit you at that point of your life that you're in right now, as opposed to if you read it 5 years previous, it mightn't have the same impact. And I think that's a kind of something that happens in coaching as well. And so there's definitely for and against that of giving multiple points of information and things like that. But of course, then there comes a point when it's just too much. And yeah, I think that the whole idea of just finding that right balance, but again, if you go back to the idea you just spoke about of principles and concepts, I think that's a much better approach, because if you can give people the general concepts and principles that will generally have a good result or outcome, I think that then it allows people to kind of explore the relevant things that they're feeling with that technique or that situation or whatever, and to kind of get it a little bit more kind of like building on those blocks of learning that they already have, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense, and I don't want to overdo the science jargon here, but you'll be familiar with them. I call them aha moments. You know, just you go in the gym one day, just something you picked up. It's a small detail or a quirk, or you're just like, the sky's open kind of thing. And that's what we try and do in our practices. Try and give enough, create an environment where there's as many of these little aha moments as we can get. And from my earlier experience in coaching, it was completely different. I'd meticulously show all the little small fine details, and that's often to beginners, which is just a complete waste of time, because they came away feeling completely incompetent. I wasted half the class just yip-yapping and talking about it. So it's actually nice to come from make such transition, because I can look back now and see what an awful job I was doing.
Yeah, that's something. It's difficult as a coach always, isn't it? Like, to find that right balance, because of course, like when beginners come in, for example, you want to give them a nice broad base, and then kind of as they progress, get deeper and deeper in certain particular pieces of information. But certainly a challenge for all of us. But just going back very quickly on a point there that Adrian was saying about the implicit and the explicit learning, I think that for me personally, for a long time, I was kind of favoring the implicit approach of putting athletes in a situation where they're able to kind of almost instinctively solve problems and things like that. But Adrian, actually, then we had a little conversation about it once over WhatsApp, I think, and he brought up a great point of game plan and strategy, and how that explicit information about the game is actually so important as well. And I think especially for our sport, that's particularly important, because for us, we have 2 rounds of 2 minutes generally at the high level. So it's not really a lot of time that you have there to be able to go through rounds and adapt your strategy and things like that. So I think it's funny, because I actually just put a post about this today about decision making and adaptability. And I think they tie in really, really well together, because you need both implicit and explicit information there to tie both of them together in a nice combination, I think, to get that strategy and game plan down while also executing it within the match or the bout,
Yeah, and in terms of seeing that and reading in practice, we have a little bit more time. We can slow things down a little more. What I've been finding a little bit, or increasing success in, is if we're trying to do a particular technique or a move, we'll just put it into open spar. We'll give a lot of opportunities for action, create these affordances. But what's been very helpful is to remind the students and athletes, just let everything else kind of be noise. And if you're trying to react to too many things, or have 4 or 5 different counters that you're going to do at a particular time, it's just not going to be a good way to add the tool to your box. Mm-hmm. And I think it's remarkable if you can land a couple of things, or defend, or react to a couple of things in real time, just all of a sudden seems to be in your toolkit. Yeah. And getting to that stage is that you could drill it over and over and over, and it's just not there. So you need to have that kind of, I don't know, self-validation or something. It's amazing how it can just turn up in the live stuff, though. And so that's been, I'm rambling kind of a bit about that, but that's been a real good strategy for me at the moment, just focusing on one particular thing in amongst the noise.
It's an interesting little aside to that. Well, it follows on from that. As you're, as you said, dialing in on 1 or 2 things that you want to see improved, regard the rest of it as noise, focus on the important information, the things that you want to see, to precipitate the action. How do you balance, or do you consider the balance between like attacking decisions or defensive decisions? Because you're always trying to balance and develop both sides of the game, the attack, the defense. And like, do you give any consideration to how you balance those?
Well, I guess I'm a little biased towards counter striking, like you said you were, Richie. So
Richie, definitely, yeah.
A lot of the and I mentioned this before, I'm reluctant to call them drills now. We call them exchanges in here, and I'm trying to get the kids, and well, I call them kids, the adults. They all seem kids to me. I'm trying to get them in this idea, this mindset that they can internalize. This is an exchange. It's on both sides, but I tend to favor and find the more beauty in the counter-striking game. So typically our practices are skewed more towards that, and that might not suit someone who's more naturally aggressive and whatnot and wants to come forward. So I definitely need to rebalance things there now and again. But generally, through when I run the exchanges, there's always an opportunity for both sides, and one's typically the aggressor, and one's typically the defender in the exchange. So it is fairly well balanced.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because that actually brings me back to, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Scott, but in Ireland we have a sport called hurling, and when I was playing hurling as a younger kind of like teenager and things, we used to always switch positions. So if you were a defender, you would have to also play as an attacker, and you kind of pick up like tricks and things that you'd see that people liked and didn't like, and maybe little things that people did when they were playing against you that, took you out of your comfort zone and things like that. And I think that kind of an approach is actually very important, because if somebody is like taken out of their comfort zone there and they're generally attacking minded, we say, well, you put them into like that counter striking environment that they got to adapt with that. It gives them a good opportunity to kind of see what's happening. And I think that goes back to that explicit learning of just having a deeper understanding and knowledge of the game. And just being able to kind of like, pick up on little things and things like that. So I think that's important for people to be able to jump in and out of those various spaces as well.
Yeah, and let me ask you, do you encourage your students to, I'm not wholly familiar with taekwondo, to switch your stance from orthodox to southpaw or whatever, or do you typically let them be a preference of their own?
Generally not. It's not something that we would see too often in the current game. It's funny, we only did an analysis last Friday of that, and it was a big part of the game maybe a decade ago, but generally no, it wouldn't be a massive part. So we would generally look to have people lead off their attacking side, which would be a little bit more stronger and faster in terms of their lead leg, which is a dominant part of the game for us right now. So yeah, but I guess you can mix that up a little bit as well, and force people to lead off their weaker side and things like that with constraints, I guess, and just to explore things a little more.
Yeah, we do use that as well, swapping of sides to control success rate in scenarios. So when we have scenarios, for example, if it was a counter-attacking scenario and the person who's countering isn't experiencing enough success to build confidence in their competence with the technique or with the skill that they're trying to work on, swapping the other person onto their non-dominant side is often a nice way to build up a little bit of if that works, because obviously sometimes the counter is dependent on what side the person's on, but often something like that, having someone attacking off their non-dominant side, is a great way of giving another person an opportunity to be successful too.
And I guess we all have the same goal. We all want these athletes to get to the stage of the last stage. And what's the last stage in fitness automation?
Oh yeah, I was going to jump into the unconscious competence, but automation is the other.
That works too. However, when we're in class, I always want this kind of cognitive element. I always want them thinking about something, and actually not going into autopilot. So I try and avoid that as much as I can, or reinforce that while we're in class, we're always thinking of someone, just to push them out that comfort zone and actually be, processing something. And it's great when you see some of the, you'll see it yourself. You have some kids come in and you can almost hear the cogs churning inside, and they're not necessarily the most athletic or the most aggressive, but they just pick things up really well. They're always thinking. And then conversely, you get the other side. So very rarely they tick all the boxes,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very important, because I know, like, from my own experience from being a competitor and from being a coach, there's certain people, they don't have those natural tendencies that maybe, for us it would be reach and very flexible legs and things like that for taekwondo specifically. But it also then gives people who don't have those natural abilities to come into the game and find their own type of success. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can take from this kind of a an approach to coaching, just being able to facilitate other people that they can go and experiment with different, I guess, different tactics and approaches for them to be successful as well.
And it's kind of, we're going off track here a little, but if you have a pair, I come across this quite a lot because we don't quite have the depth in the squad yet, but I always encourage them too, and it's tough for the B side or the person who's maybe less experienced, but I always kind of want the more experienced person, or the person, the side with the more ability to bring the other side up, to stay ahead of them rather than come down to that level. Try and pick your partner up. Does that make sense? I'm wondering how you deal with that, because it can tend to be, especially, you know, I've done this myself, when you're going with someone who perhaps isn't experienced, you really slow it down for them, and you have to, but you don't want to overdo that so that no one's really getting anything out of it. So looking for that kind of challenge point and that staying in that area. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think there's many of us that have such a diverse and, you know, and strong and deep squad of athletes that we're working with, that everyone has 5, 6, 7 training partners who are on the same level as them. It doesn't work that way. So, you know, very often we're asking the most experienced person to find a new challenge within the scenario. So if I would tend to look at it in terms of, you know, if you want to talk about your exchanges, your interactions, if they're starting to be successful more than 60% of the time, it's getting to that point where it's like, okay, now we're into, the brain is turned off. Now it's too easy. We're not in a challenge state. We've got to try and find something else. So for them, for those situations, it's a case of, I'll happily break the scenario or the game or the exchange to bias it a little bit more in terms of the other person, or to restrict, add challenge, add, you know, cognitive load to the person that I'm looking to continue working. Otherwise, for me, what happens when you have someone who is world class? You can no longer train them because they don't have a training partner. So you have to be able to make subpar. That's an unfortunate. It's disrespectful to the people themselves. People who aren't quite on that stage yet, even if it's just that they're, like, we say, one of Richie's training partners over the years, like Thomas at 57 kilos is not a match for Richie at 85, 90 kilos. Mm-hmm. But if they both challenge each other with the appropriate, you know, scenarios and the appropriate constraints, they can both improve, even though they're not a natural fit. So those, I think, are the things that we need to do. And I mean, plenty of examples of them, but those are the things I think that really allow someone to stay, or for the training environment to stay relevant to a person for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I do try and remind a lot of the students that who are on the way up, that them coming in and getting their ass handed to them day after day, they're probably getting more out of it. So what would you do with someone who like you said, was at the high level or head and shoulders above everyone else? You tend to handicap them or encourage them to find alternate training partners?
Yeah, for me, luckily at the moment I'm able to kind of like jump in, because a lot of my higher level guys are still teenagers and things like that, so I'm able to kind of jump in there and give them a little bit of a test, because obviously just with that little bit more experience and being a senior as well, it's a challenge for them. But it's something that I think of a lot. It's like, what am I going to do when these guys catch up and are beating me up handily enough? What am I going to do then? So I think that comes back to being a facilitator as a coach, and having that know-how, how to adapt the constraints and things like that to make them continuously challenge and to be put in situations which test them. And
ultimately, we want that day to come, right? We want our students to leapfrog us, and that certainly isn't good for the ego. Do you feel the coach has to be the sharpest, best?
No. My ego is long buried. It died a death years ago. I have been surpassed in every conceivable way on the floor by my students, and I'm more than happy to say that in a public forum. I am delighted to say that, my students have definitely surpassed my achievements and my abilities in competitive taekwondo, and that's absolutely the goal. And I hope I have many more that do that. But I mean, in terms of the things that you were talking about there, and how do we challenge them, you can increase the mental load. So you can ask them to be focusing on mental skills while doing, a an exchange that's based around, I said, whether it's an attack and a counter attack, a scenario in the ring, you can add mental load or cognitive load by introducing concentration, thought stopping, distraction training. You can ask them to be shifting internal to external focus, reacting to a scoreboard, a changing scenario. They score, it's denied, they score, there's a foul, there's a change in the scoreboard, requires a response. You can change physical load, so you can swap their training partners more quickly when they're in there. Or, if there's a score required to get a break or to get out or to swap or rotate, maybe they have to get 2 scores, or they have to score with, offside and their preferred side, or they have to score in combination. Or, everything is about playing with, I think, respecting them more as an athlete and giving them a challenge that's relevant to them in that moment, that that doesn't really interfere with what the other person is trying to achieve. So in challenging the maybe the more skilled person, it shouldn't be interfering with the with the exchange for the less skilled person. They should still be trying to achieve the same things and not kind of put off or distracted by what's going on. That's a fine balance. And when you get it wrong, you get it wrong. And you just try something else and accept that you got it wrong.
It sounds as though you're gamifying a lot of your practice, and that's what I'm trying to do as well. I have been for a while, and it can certainly help engage people.
I think that's and we spoke about this a good few times. That whole idea of gamifying and games in martial arts is something that's frowned upon because people actually don't understand the term. So the whole idea of basically having 2 active sides, and one has to achieve their task and the other has to achieve a task of their own, I think is where it's at, rather than actually having a game. When you say a game, sometimes people think it's a game of tag and a game of chase, and I think that's something that we kind of find as a challenge in the martial arts forum.
Terminology is a thing. Terminology is a thing, because we had issues in our coach education when we used the old terminology and of the 80s in terms of teaching games for understanding, because it sounded like something that would be easier to get across to people than things like ecological dynamics or constraints-based learning, or that's a tough thing to sell to a 16-year-old who's never coached. But games for understanding, as in we have a game that teaches understanding. It seemed so much easier until we came across this nomenclature problem, which is people thought games automatically, it's not as important, it's frivolous, it's messing, it's it's a tough sell to get people to understand that no, this is not chase, this is not tag, this is not stuck in the mud, this is, our game is called sparring, our game is it's the fight game, and and in the end that's our whole sport is a game. So we're just taking smaller subsets of that to make it easier to understand.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. We were speaking a little bit about overcoaching. Where do you think the line is, or is it balances between? And I mentioned to Richie before, some of the pushback I get, or the perception, the way I deliver my coaching is perhaps I'm considered that I undercoach. And could you maybe give me what your definition of that would be, or some of the hallmarks or characteristics of undercoaching might be, to see how many fit with me?
But personally, I think it's something that we all struggle with, and I don't think there's a right answer to this. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Adrian, but I think that's always a balancing act, and you kind of have to get it right. Sometimes I feel like I'm overcoaching, other times I feel like I'm a little bit passive, and I think it's finding that sweet spot is one of the most challenging things about this whole approach. And I think the more especially during the lockdown and things like that at the moment, I've been reading up a lot, obviously, and this term facilitator keeps coming up time and time again, whether it's in psychology, whether it's in skill act, no matter where, it just keeps coming up. And I think that's something that it's the key, but knowing how much to facilitate and how much to be a little bit more proactive with it. I think that's where the real coaching is, and the experience maybe comes in a bit more,
Yeah, I think from the perspective of the over under coaching, like between the disciplines, I find I flip flop. So when we're coaching sparring, I would tend to be on the Like, certainly not was a habitually undercoaching, but I would definitely be less vocal, and I would step in less, and I would, jump in and correct form, technique, etc. Much less when it's sparring. I would let the situation develop. I'll ask more questions. I'll reset challenges. But when it comes to patterns, I very definitely can be guilty of overcoaching. It's just jumping in as technical correction, and it's struggling to find the language to frame the right challenge for patterns. But I think characteristics wise, when I think you'll recognize when you're undercoaching, when the rate of failure is causing a little bit of a shot to the confidence or the feeling of competence of the person. So it'll usually be where you've got the level of challenge wrong, when the game isn't the teacher anymore, and you're failing to recognize that the game isn't a teacher right now, and that something is needed, some intervention is needed. I mean, the coaching doesn't need to be, I'll tell you how to solve the problem, but the coaching might need to be, I need to adjust this problem so that you're capable of finding a solution.
Yeah, I agree with that. I find myself having to do that quite a lot, which means I haven't calibrated the challenge point correctly, and I'll stop everything we're doing, and we'll kind of regress and make it a little easier. Because I spoke to, when I mentioned to Richie before, one of the discussions I had with a friend of mine. He's a PhD in sports psych, and he was talking about STT and the motivation theory, and you need that sense of competency. And often when guys and girls are leaving my class, they feel anything but competent, because it's been a real hard, challenging class. And I do worry that I'm a little overzealous on that side, and I need to bring that back now and again, and give them the appropriate opportunity to feel good and feel competent. So that's definitely a weakness of mine. I'm always thinking if they're not challenged, if they're not in that uncomfortable space, in that growth zone, then we're not getting anything out of the practice. But so I need to dial that back from time to time strategically.
Weakness is definitely the wrong word. If you're that reflective on your own coaching practice that you can identify how people are feeling and what their level of challenge was, and whether or not they're experiencing that feeling of competence, you're definitely not failing. That's I think that's a very, very good place to be. We can always just turn the dial too far one way or the other, and luckily people are resilient, and we get to have a bad day and come back. And those bad days teach good lessons too. I mean, there's resilience that comes out of that, and there's a lot of other good things that come out of having those bad days. So for me, I try not to worry about messing it up. I mean, that's one of the things that when you lose your ego, you can forgive yourself a little bit as well about the not having a brilliant coaching day. You just go home, you make yourself a cup of coffee, and you go, right, okay, today wasn't great, but there's tomorrow, so we'll try tomorrow, and hope that one's better. But
yeah, I think that anybody who's going to be successful in this domain as well, in terms of combat, they're going to have to eventually find some sort of resilience that they need to overcome, and that challenge where it's not going to be easy, because they're not going to reach their full potential if that's not the case, And I think being outside of that comfort zone is something kind of where the best live a little bit of the time, especially early on when they're really developing, I think. So I think that having your practice based on that is something that's actually very good. Now, some people it might not suit because maybe their confidence is down and things like that. So yeah, getting that sweet spot, I think, is key. So something that we have to be aware of for sure.
I know some of the pushback you get also is or I've heard it before. Not everyone wants to achieve great things in the sport. They're just coming in to have fun with their pals or find a workout and that. And I can see that. I can see that perspective. But I think everyone who steps in the gym wants to be better, and so there's always that capacity for improvement. I mean, they all have different goals, but why not set your practice up to let everyone improve?
Because that's where the human enjoyment comes from. Obviously, is the development and the progression. Like if you come and you just get a sweat, it's not going to be something that they'll stick at for a long time. They might do it for a few weeks and then they'll eventually just fall off. I think as humans, we're looking for that incremental growth, whether you're looking to be a competitor or whether you're looking just to do it for fun. It's like when you go to the gym, if everybody was lifting the same weight every single week, I don't think that they would do it for a long time. You know, it's
Right.
human nature for us to find these like incremental pieces of development.
But if you take it like exactly as Scott has said there, like the person who's coming in, if they're not into it for, like, if they don't want to get better, what you've got is someone who's looking to be entertained. And that will last in the same way as a movie does. You can be entertained for a while. But as soon as you've watched, like, you know, how often has it happened? You start watching a box set or a series and, you know, 4 or 5 episodes in, it's just, you've figured out what the pattern is, you know, what how the story's going to go, and it's just not interesting or entertaining anymore. And I think like that's what happens when you're no longer engaged mentally, when you're not learning. And the brain has a very interesting way of fooling you. So you can sit down and watch, you know, a documentary or a series of documentaries in Discovery, and you think you're learning something, but you're not. And because you're not actually, everything's being fed to you. You're not, your brain is being tricked into thinking it's being engaged, but eventually it falls short. And I think that's what happens. You can go to a class where, you know, there's something novel every day, or there's something that's easy but different, and it's engaging in an entertaining sense. But it's not as satisfying in the long term as that feeling that competence gives, which is I can see myself progressing, I can see my skill improving. And that conversely, that's a huge challenge we have with high performing people who are already really, really good. And that's why they'll often go into other, you know, domains, I think, is where they get to the point where they can no longer perceive competence increasing. The increments are too small. And they're also, as I said, it's that path to success where there's back steps. You know, you have your 2 steps back and another 2 steps forward, and maybe a 3rd step forward before 2 back. And maybe the line gradually goes up over time, but you can't see it. You know, it's very hard to see it. And I think that's where, as a coach, you know, letting people experience, like, or helping them to engage with developing competence is a massive towards motivation. And then finding a way to help people recognize their improvement or their competence gains when the gains get small is another challenge.
Like that's one of the things for me, just after I said to you, Scott, that I started jiu-jitsu recently, and for me, going from taekwondo at a decent level, and as Adrian was saying, the increments of growth are just really, really small, and you're almost going backwards a few steps to go forward. Just going in there as a white belt and getting those newbie gains and developing so quickly, like, that's addictive, like, you know, and that's where the enjoyment comes for a lot of people, I think.
Well, and I think that's an advantage we have in MMA. There's so many pieces to string together that there's really not enough years in your life to be a master at everything. But it's also why it's so crucial to get the training right, you know, and not waste time. We spoke about coaching before. I was doing a little bit of blogging before I wrote something, just kind of calculating the lost time. And if we consider an hour training session and each unit is a minute, you know, if a coach is yapping or talking or bullshitting for 6 minutes, that's 10% of your development time. You start adding that up, and that the compound effect of that is quite profound. So again, I overshoot and I try and say little, and you know, we're on the clock. Let's go. And but there's definitely a great deal of idle time in the traditional methods. And like you spoke about, one-sided drilling is you've effectively lost 50% plus.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that unifies us all, isn't it? So, I mean, you look at what it'll take to reach a high level of performance, and, you know, all factors being equal, the person who can make best use of their time over their competitive career will probably get the most gains. Like, you know, I had a huge thing where at one point in time I was convinced that one of my more successful athletes was as successful as she was never injured. You know, virtually all of the other athletes that you'd look at around the place, they'd be missing a month here or 2 weeks here, or, you know, and then they're constantly in these cycles of coming back up to form. It's like, well, if you're never injured, you're just training, and, you know, you're always working from a baseline and going forward rather than going back and trying to get to your baseline. And that's just a small example of case in point, where if you can be, like you said, if you can be a little more efficient, if you can get 5 or 6 minutes into every training session, you know, that hour that a person is committed to you is, you know, 10% more valuable. Great. You know, that sounds great.
Yeah. Adrian, speaking of like, you're a coach developer, are you following a kind of curriculum here? or you like to kind of impose your own kind of philosophies and stuff?
Okay, so just to quickly, as quickly as I can, put that across. All of the coaching programs for all of the sports in Ireland are developed on a national curriculum or national syllabus. So that would define the learning outcomes for each of the coaching levels. But within that, then each sport has to develop a sport-specific implementation of that. So what does, for example, an outcome related to planning ability mean if you're doing taekwondo versus soccer versus rugby? And they're quite different things. So yes, we can absolutely implement both our own personal philosophies, overlaying how the learning objectives are achieved, and also the sports philosophy over that as well. So there's a good degree of freedom while still meeting it within a national standard of competence.
And they are different sports, of course, but the principles we talk about are the same. They're kind of broad. Do you tend to buck the trend compared to your colleagues, or are you all kind of somewhat on the same page?
I think what you'll find is that, no, not entirely bucking the trend, but what you'll tend to see is that the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of, in particular, the skill acquisition side of things, tend to be seen as more like, well, that's more advanced. So rather than it's an underlying philosophy of how people learn, it's a case of, well, first we'll teach coaches how to, we call it like the ideal framework. So introduce and demonstrate a skill, give an explanation with a couple of coaching points, observe, practice, provide feedback, and then you go into detail on that. That's still fine, as a general acronym or, mnemonic to help people remember, sequence things. But then you have to get into, well, it's an athlete that's learning. It's a human being. How does the human being work? How does that change if the human being is 4, 17, 55? How does it change if the person has, more or less experience within the sport in a different frame of reference? And how does it change depending on what the goal of the activity is? And, that's where it's a higher level coaching concept, I suppose. And it's fine that it's at a higher level. But definitely within the team sports, in a big way, they're far more keen to push coaching philosophy this way. Within the individual sports, less so, I would say. Okay. And definitely, as Richie alluded to in the beginning, and a reason that, your chat on Talent Equation podcast jumped out at us is because within fight sports, within martial arts, within a lot of individual sports, this whole area hasn't really, it's not like we can, pick a book off a shelf, read it and go, that's how it'll work for me. There's a lot more discussions to be had, experimentation to be done. And, I think that's exciting too.
And I imagine it's more of a challenge for you guys because you're dealing with younger kids. So there's a lot more of this kind of maybe extrinsic motivation involved there. Their parents are forcing them and shoehorning them into this sport. I tend to think the adults are walking into my gym and club. They want to be there. So that's a little different. A couple of times my kids' coach is called in or whatever, and I've had to go and teach the kids. So, but they say you can't coach unless you can coach kids. So I'm acutely aware of my limitations now.
Yeah, but that's true. But do you know what? Since I've kind of adapted more to this type of coaching, I found that the kind of like the people's mindset towards sparring and things like that has changed, and it's more enjoyable for people now. And I know that was like Stu on the Talent Equation. I know that's what he's hitting at behind us. All of this is to get more people involved in sport by having it more enjoyable and things like that. And I've noticed like for young children who join Taekwondo, for the most part, it's because their parents want them to learn self-defense, which usually is a byproduct of children being shy and not really looking to be too aggressive and things like that. So when you tell them put on the sparring gear, it's usually met with a sigh and not really enthusiastic faces. But now I've recently found that like they're actually really enjoying it and they're much more open to it with this type of an approach, to be honest, And
I think with sparring, I found this at the last gym I coached at. I used to coach cardio kickboxing, which just crushed my soul minute by minute every week. And I managed to convince, I hate to sound sexist here, but there was, some of the ladies in there, they just came for a workout, and I managed to convince them to try out the regular classes. And I put them in situations where we were, you know, sparring super light with me, controlled. They had nothing to worry about, and they just loved it. So I think people there's a certain fear that they're, especially when they're starting, they're going to get, you know, beat up or injured or whatnot. And if you can adequately remove that and reassure them that it can be done safely, I think it's extremely engaging. And it's hard to find people who don't love it, actually.
I find as well that the benefit of it is when people kind of have an understanding of what the limitations of the exchange are, for example, they kind of feel a little bit safer in terms of when they go free sparring. Maybe it's just a little bit more open and a little bit more chaotic, especially with children, you know. But another point on that as well is that I find with children the terminology is massive, and when you introduce things like levels and progression and points and coins and all these game, like, you know, video game kind of terminology, I think the level of engagement just goes through the roof, is what I found with it anyway. And this type of coaching actually facilitates that as well, is because they kind of go hand in hand. You know, you can go through levels and you can morph into different techniques and all this stuff, and children love that, because that's kind of like what they're doing, and that's what they're able to relate to as well, you know.
Do you find I'm finding in MMA, and maybe it's because it's a longer learning curve. There's so many disciplines to throw in, and it is a newer sport. So people have come in from, not so much now, this new breed of kids that are coming up have done everything from the start. But typically it was a boxer would be coming into having it around it as grappling as wrestling, or vice versa. But it seems to be the almost like the peak age, and I'm sure that'll come down. But the peak age of MMA fighters at the moment, I'd say, is around 30, maybe even a little beyond that. But I guess in Taekwondo it's much younger. I mean, you've retired already, Richie.
Yeah, so I retired in 2017. So I would have been maybe 25 or something. So, but I would have been competing at the highest level possible for 10 years. So 2007, I would have gone on the national team, and I would have been competing 2007, 2017 at that level. So yeah, I just think that, like, if you look at the world and European champions from the last few years in our sport, I think it's safe to say, Adrian, majority of them will be under the age of 23.
Yeah, definitely. They're definitely getting younger.
Under the age of 30.
23.
Oh yeah, and what you'll find is there are some who've been winning for a considerable length of time, you know, for potentially 7-8 years, who are 30 thereabouts. But the majority of the first time world champions, the age of a person winning a world title for the first time is definitely dropping drastically to early 20s. And I think a big factor of that is exactly the same as with Richie. It's those people are potentially engaged with a national team and traveling to international competitions from the age of 14. So 10 years into, and I mean, for a lot of them, that's 10 years into 5, 6, 7 training sessions a week. That's, you know, making and cutting weight. It's traveling abroad 4, 5, 6 times a year. It's saving all of your money. It's not going out with your friends. It's not going to birthdays. It's all that stuff for 10 years. And you're still in your early 20s. It's, you know, whereas I think for the likes of myself, being a little bit older than Richie, I didn't start that journey till I was 21, 22. So for me, I did 9 years of it and stopped competing for the most part internationally at 30. But so I had pretty much all 10 years as part of an adult career. I think that was far more common years ago. And certainly didn't come close to winning anything major in the first 5, 6 years of it, you know. So I think now that we're seeing so many young people jumping up to that level, you know, it's going to change things. And you may well see that. I mean, if all of those kids you see on YouTube and Facebook that are, you know, 6 years of age and doing really astounding drills on thigh pads, you know, in their parents' kitchens, you know, if those kids come through, by the time they're 18, they'll have already had a 14-year career. You know, I don't know how much of an adult career they're going to have in MMA, you know.
Mm-hmm. So you think perhaps it's more when you start with the general longevity or the window?
I think it's more like if you're looking into Jean Cote and things like that in terms of the, you know, phases of training, you know, you have your sampling phase, your, you know, and so on, but it'll finish up on that specialization phase. I think it's more about how long you're specialized, and I think the earlier you specialize, you know, there's only a certain amount of time that anyone will spend engaged in any activity at that level. I mean, it's very, not only is it very taxing, but just I suppose as human beings, we search for novelty as well. We don't want to, it's very hard to have the exact same routine the exact same attention to the same task for a prolonged period of time. You want change, you want some novelty, you want, something to get you excited. And it's going to be very hard to constantly reinvent that within the one sport or the one environment, which, for those who can do it, huge respect, but they're rare.
Yeah, I think as well, for us, like it's a hobby. We're not getting paid for this. We're paying to go abroad and to compete. Whereas maybe in the MMA scene, there's that goal of maybe reaching UFC and Bellator and big promotions like this of making it an actual career. So I guess there's a little bit of a difference there. But generally, yeah, it's interesting to see how that would play out with the amount of specialization that has to be done, like you were saying there. And when these kids get to 10, 15 years of this type of a lifestyle, will they still have the passion for it and things like that? It'll be interesting to see, especially with the prize money and things like that in the MMA side.
So I know there seems to be a disconnect there, though, because I do, I advocate for parents that are coming in as well to our gym. And there's been a few that perhaps want their kids in 5 days a week. And I said, if you want your kid to be, a junior world champion at 15, 16, this isn't the place for you. Encourage them to come once or twice a week and go and play baseball, basketball, whatever. However, early specialization, we know the downfalls, the burnout and the lose interest and whatnot, but it's also consistent with what we talk about, and reaching that level of expertise. So if I'm making sense here, ideally, like you said, they're few and far between these kids that can really buckle down and stay committed that long. Mm-hmm. Ideally, that would be the way to go, right?
Potentially, I guess. Like I know that. Like we only recently did a little episode on this. It'll be released this week, so anybody who's watching the video will be already out. But we had a long discussion with John Mackey about this, the whole idea of early specialization and the 10,000 hour rule. But yeah, it goes back to this idea of generally people don't end up becoming at a high level when it comes to senior age. And would that be right? That's kind of the general thinking behind that.
So yeah, I mean, the big thing is, if we take the issue of time, right? If time is unlimited and you have a student in front of you, what will you spend your time on? So, you're going to spend your time on what you kind of feel is best for their long-term development. But once you introduce that, say at 40, perhaps at 13 or 14 years of age, that, okay, well, but there's selections now. And so you have to win this tournament to be eligible for selection. Then you have to, once you're selected, attend training at this level. Once you're doing that, then your performance at the championships is now judged and measured and weighed. And then you have to go to this level. And it becomes a kind of a constant repeating thing. So now the priority isn't, well, what's best for your long-term development? The priority is, what is going to give us the most return on our time investment now in terms of results in the ring in the short to medium term. And I think that changes everything. So I think it's more about the phases. It's like, how long do you spend in each time? And it should probably be not quite a pyramid, but certainly something like a truncated cone or something, where you want to spend a lot of time in the discovery phases, and you want to do that spread across a range of sports and activities, I think, where you're going to learn an awful lot of skills. Because when we start, we don't know if that 6-year-old is going to be, a 25-year-old martial artist or a 25-year-old, platform diver. They could go any way, but we'd like that at 25 years of age, they still would look back at their time spent with us and say, yeah, that was worthwhile. So I think for me, it's like moving them too quickly through the phases, I think, is the problem. That early specialization, it's not about, maybe even if they were spending the time, but they're spending the time diversified across a range of activities and sports. I think the mistake is thinking that you have to get, for mastery within a sport, you have to spend this huge amount of time early within one sport. But everything we do in life impacts everything else. So, if I have I have a 5-year-old, and if he spent, a good portion of last year going to dance classes, hip hop, because it's just what he wanted to do. Now he wants to punch the heads off people, but he's going to start maybe doing a little bit of that in September. But he also wants to kick a ball. He also wants to play in a slide and a swing. It's like, great, perfect, do all that stuff. I have a 14-year-old, and I'm lucky if I can get him away from the PlayStation long enough to hit a few pads or do something like that. So that's his journey. You know, it's a little bit different. So I'm definitely thinking that, you know, rather than it being about a specific number of hours or an early investment in a sport, you know, if you're thinking in terms of spending your time, you're one of those parents who would like to see their children be successful, and you'd like to see yourself as doing what's necessary to support that. It really is a case of, look, there's a whole wide range of skills out there that they might need. And if it's enjoyable for them to explore those skills, give them the time to do that. And then nature will take care of itself. Their interests, their passions, the way the coaches react with them, the way their friends have oriented themselves, you know, into different things, where their competence, you know, where they're feeling competent and challenged and confident, it's where they're going to go.
Right. And, you know, I do the same with my kids. I throw bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks, you know, and that's kind of my strategy there. I just felt when we were talking earlier about, it almost seems like the narrative is now we're discouraging kids from early specialization, whereas if you have a kid that is wholly, you know, motivated and passionate and they want to do that, I don't know. Again, it just seems a little bit of a disconnect there. I see the detriment, I see the problems with it and the burnout and all the psychological issues. But again, if we're looking at things from a accumulation of time and experience, then I don't know. I'm not quite as convinced that it's always a bad thing. That's what I mean.
But if a child wants to do that themselves, like that, by all means, like it should be what they enjoy. But I think the important thing is here of a parent putting them into martial arts and only having them training 6 times a week because they want them to become a champion. I think that's what the key is. But if a child is enjoying something because it's what they love and they love going to see their friends and all that, I don't see any harm in allowing them to train as often as they like.
No, and we all recognize, you know, the parents that are, you know, living vicariously through their kids or whatever, and pushing their kids into the sport. And,
I don't have inside experience in this, but like I've 21 years and I haven't had one of them yet. That's, you know, the ones, the early investors that, you know, that stick with it and come through and go to senior and grow up and get married and they're still involved. I haven't had one yet. So one of these days, someone will come along who does that and shock the pants off me. You know, it's going to happen. Just, you know, there has to be someone who's going to do that. But so far, none of those. But
so as the adults in the room, we're just kind of trying to guide them and make you know, prospectively make the right decision for them, I guess. So even if they, you know, encourage that, and that's where this encouragement is coming from, to diversify this.
Yeah. But it's also in what we offer. Like, I mean, you know, is it physically possible for someone to come to Richie and say, listen, I'd like to train 6 times a week, Richie? You know, is that something Richie facilitates? And for me, the answer is no, I don't actually facilitate that. It's not possible. You don't get to do that, you know. But, you know, if you go to a gym, a club, or an environment where that is possible, fair enough. What we would see in Ireland, I think, more so is like, you know, particularly in the cities, where it's like, oh, well, I could go there on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I can go there on a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you know, and they do it that way. And, you know, if that's what they do and that's what the child wants to do, as you said, I wouldn't be screaming at them. We tend to see it actually more from the point of view of the Gaelic games and football, where the various leagues don't manage their schedules very well, and the kids have training and matches almost overlapping. So they could have 2 trainings one day, 2 matches another day, a training and a match on another day, and it could all happen in the same week, and, you know, at different age groups and levels. Like, that's where we would fear for burnout, where they enjoy the sport, but eventually at some point in the season, the calendar becomes too much for them and they're asked to perform too much. And I don't think there's a fear of that in the martial arts. There's no martial arts coach that I've come across ever who has, you know, multiple competitions a week for any prolonged period of the season, or that major, you know, a performance-oriented kind of program. I just haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Slightly off topic again. How do you, as coaches, because we're all human beings, how do you temper your kind of the propensity to have favoritism in class?
Richie, away you go.
And
that's a tricky one.
What do they call it? I think the Matthew effect or whatever. And I've seen this, you know, with just that little bit. It's well documented, you know, just that little bit of extra attention, the extra 5 minutes on the pads here, the extra the attention is going, and it snowballs. So yeah. I'm always reminding myself of that. But again, I'm human, and I have my favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think it's natural for a coach when you're putting in so much of yourself and your time and your effort into it, and you go there, and there's certain athletes and students who have that attitude and that mindset, and they're almost giving it back. I think it's natural to kind of to put a little bit more effort into those guys, and to give them a little bit more of your time, because as we said, especially for us, it might be a lot of people are there and they don't want to be there. And of course, we have a duty to give them as much as anybody else. But I guess when people come there with a good attitude and they're willing to learn, I think it's just natural for coaches to maybe help them a little bit more.
Yeah, isn't that it's not a cop out, and it's perfectly natural to, you know, again, maybe have your favorites, but wouldn't that be a sign of a better coach? You know, I always use the analogy of a teacher. If all your kids came and brought you an apple every day and sat in the front and answered every question and did their homework right, it'd be the easiest job in the world. We have that over here. You know, the difference in especially the American school system. You know, you have private schools and your public schools and whatnot. You know, credit to these teachers who work in these with problem kids, and so using that kind of analogy, I always try and remind myself it's the more uncoachable kids and the more of the challenging pupils and students that I should really be throwing my time into a bit more.
Definitely, and you know what, I think it's important as well to have a little bit of a system around you and have these assistant coaches. I think that's where it comes in, because you can't do it all yourself. Like you can't go and teach an hour, instruct the class, coach the class, give feedback, and then go around and give everybody a little bit of your time then as well. This is virtually impossible. So I think having that support structure and having people around where you have a good system of everybody gets an attention and everybody is involved, and I think that's kind of more important, I guess, than focusing on any particular individuals.
And sorry,
go ahead. Oh, sorry, I was interrupting you.
Are you constantly kind of grooming's maybe the wrong word? Are you constantly kind of developing assistant coaches and whatnot, and identifying these kind of leaders within the group?
Definitely. Like for me, my school is pretty young and new, but at the moment, like our black belts are now involved in coaching, and they all have a class that they turn up to each week, and they're actively assistants with those groups, and they're involved with the tournaments and the young kids, and I think it's very important, and they love it as well. They love getting that little bit of leadership and a little bit of permission to go and explore for themselves, and maybe, you know, take on a class, maybe do a warm up here and there and things like that. And I think they take a lot from it, and they enjoy it a lot. I think that's one of the most important things in an academy or a club structure. I think you can't do it all by yourself. It's impossible. So anybody, it goes back to kind of like ego again. And I find this myself, that sometimes I'm struggling to kind of let go of the reins a little bit and leave these people kind of like almost learn in the deep end as such, and you know they're going to make mistakes, but that's just part of it. And sometimes I can be it's something that I need to work on, definitely, is just kind of leaving the reins go a little bit to allow these people to learn and to adjust. But yeah, I think that's a massive part of any structure or club.
I think,
I certainly try and encourage that. You know, if I'm on the mat with 10 of the students or athletes, I'll openly invite them to be my 10 assistant coaches, you know. And I know in a lot of more traditional schools and whatnot, it'd be almost blasphemous to you know, talk back to the coach or add your own input. So we're definitely trying to make this like a collaborative experience. Back more to the coaching side of things, how would you typically debrief and set up the class, like the start and the end to your classes? Do you have a strategy for that? Or?
Yeah, Adrian, I think you have a good little system for your evaluations and things like that, especially what you've done in squads. I think is quite good.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we will do when we start it's almost like a more formal presentation in some ways. We'll start with here's what we want out of today. So before we start the training session, we'll explain what's in the training session and what we want out of the training session. So we'll know we've had a good session if by the end of the session we've done X, Y, Z. And I think I remember this from like going to training sessions with instructors, and you don't know what's ahead of you. And so you don't really know how to manage your energy, or how to, there's something always in the back of your mind about what comes next. You can't actually just immerse yourself in the task. So I always kind of felt like once you know what's ahead of you, okay, there's a good and a bad side to it, and sometimes you'll need to surprise people, but you can kind of, picture it, and you can throw yourself into it and not worry about what comes next. And then at the end of the session, a couple of things. We will usually debrief, but it's an opportunity to check for learning. So, did you actually get across what you wanted to get across? Did people learn, at least in the short term, what it was you hoped that they would learn? And also it's a chance for, you can get feedback as a coach through that. So if they didn't learn what you expected them to learn, well, there's a message in you. I didn't communicate it well. I pitched it at the wrong level. Something went wrong. Equally, they could just tell you, listen, I still don't get that thing, or, and all feedback from that point of view is good feedback to have. But if from a cognitive perspective, people leaving the session know they have a name for what they learned, they have a name for what they got better at. They're aware that we practiced this, we got better at this, we weren't so good at the beginning, we were better at the end. You're walking out of there knowing what you were good at rather than what you messed up. So even if you had 2 or 3 things you were corrected on during the session, if you walk out of a session knowing I got better at this, well, then you're going home on a high, because you're going out of there feeling you got better because you spent the time there. I think that's what we want every session, isn't it? That people walk out of the session feeling like they got better because they were in the session.
Yeah, I do like that, the clear goals. I tend to sometimes change things on the fly and whatnot. And with my accent over here, they often are a little misunderstood too. But I tell them a lot, if one person doesn't understand what we're doing here, you fucked up. And if more than one person doesn't understand, then I fucked up. So I'm constantly reiterating and trying to simplify what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. It's a hard balancing act, this whole coaching gig, isn't it?
It really is. It's the biggest challenge. I love it, but the more I get into it, the more I feel I'll never get. It's like a mountain.
So many rabbit holes, yeah.
I was just saying the art and science of it. I ended up on mute somehow.
I thought my headphones died or something.
No, I think somehow we ended up putting everyone on mute. But all I was saying, and that was the art and science of it. Yeah, it's not a straightforward game.
Yeah, it's tricky. Great chat, lads.
Certainly enjoying that.
Thanks for your time, Scott. It's been a great chat. I've enjoyed delving into some topics there, and made a few mental notes of some things that I'd like to employ on our own side as well. So yeah. Fantastic.
Oh, definitely. Me, I got a lot out of this too. What I'm finding is that I'm always going down these different avenues and stuff, so I never ever stay on topic. But I'll try and do better with that in the future.
That's good. It means we're all learning.
We'll definitely be staying in touch on the Facebook and Instagram and all those kind of things.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to inspire me to up my game in terms of. I've been kind of having a little bit of a pity party the last few weeks, because we've only been open 3-4 months and we're forced to shut down. Again, no help and whatever. It's a challenge for everyone. There's a lot of people worse off than us. But yeah, kudos to you. You guys are just pumping it out each and every day.
That was busy.
How many typically downloads or listeners do you get for your podcast?
We actually haven't tracked that really. It's basically just going on YouTube. We have to get a bit better. We're using Anchor all right on our podcast for Spotify and things, but we have to get a bit more active on that. I need to pull the MP3 clips off and get them a bit more active, I think. But generally we have a few hundred views on each YouTube video. So yeah, we're getting some good feedback anyway, and some people are listening.
Yeah, that's it. It's a builder for us as well. We spent, as I said, all of last year on the other platforms in terms of Instagram, Facebook, and this gives us a whole different medium to tackle concepts that we couldn't through the kind of the short form videos and the short form content that you can put on Facebook and Instagram. So yeah, it's a great little experiment for us now, and this was the perfect opportunity to really crank it up.
Yeah, I do like again, taekwondo is not my wheelhouse at all, but enjoy your sparring breakdowns and stuff, and it's really valuable. We'll at least have 2 more listeners, myself and my mother.
Super.
Brilliant.
Super. Appreciate that.
Brilliant. So, is there anywhere where people can find out a little bit more or get in contact with you, Scott, if they want to get involved and maybe stuff?
Well, as you say, Richie, you're one of the guests on my own podcast, which I haven't even got around to finalising the name yet. But I am based in Milwaukee. Our new MMA gym is Primal MKE. That's the airport code for Milwaukee. So primalmilwaukee.com. And I do a bit of my own writing and put some articles and stuff on there as well. So yeah, I'm way behind you guys, but don't sleep on me. I'm trying to catch up.
No, there's some good stuff there as well. Might link up your podcast on the talent equation. I think there's some very valuable stuff for martial arts there as well. So we'll link that up for anybody who wants to go a little bit deeper. Okay,
thank you. And I'll be definitely back to pick your brains, and I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Thanks for talking. Excellent.
Thanks for doing it, Scott. I appreciate it.
All right.
Right, take care.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye.